All right. So last week we finished up the Septuagint. So we'll do a brief review of what we covered last week, and we'll get into the next influential early translation. Let's see. We'll go. So last week we talked about one of the, it's a very important textual variant uh, coming to, here we go. Whether or not the CSB or whether or not the underlying text says they pierced my hands and feet, or like a lion, they pin my hands and feet, or like lions, they maul my hands and feet. And so we started talking about that last week, what the underlying text says. What I sought to demonstrate to you was that the Greek Septuagint agrees with nearly all of our translations, that it says they pierced my hands and feet, while the Hebrew shows that they maul my hands and feet. And so that most translations say, most Christian translations, I should say, render the Septuagint. They pierced my hands and feet. There are a few translations like the MAV that are committed to rendering the Masoretic text or the Hebrew. And so when they do, they will choose something of the nature of like a lion, they pin my hands and feet. The JPS, which is a Jewish translation, they opt for the Masoretic text as well. And they say like lions, they maul my hands and feet. And what I wanted to show you is that the verb pin or they maul, that's not in the underlying text for the Hebrew. So it would read very clunky both in the Hebrew as well as in the Greek, just to read like a lion, my hands and feet, or like lions, my hands and feet, where this Septuagint has they pierced. So we talked about that last week. I showed you what it would look like in the Hebrew if the Septuagint was back translated into the Hebrew versus like a lion as it's represented in the Masoretic text. The difference is one stroke, whether the letter be a wow, this letter right here, or a yod, this letter right here. And the difference is just how long is that stroke, right? And so when it comes to something like this, printed digitally, nice big bold font, it's very easy versus someone's handwriting. It can be very difficult. And a short stroke could turn you into a yod, or a long stroke can turn you into a wow, okay, in the same sentence. And that single stroke would change the interpretation of the sentence. So that's a pretty big deal. And I showed you, Pastor had brought this up in one of his messages, that there was a textual variant in which this tittle made the difference in the translation. In his case, though, I tried to show that in his case, both renderings made sense. They both fit contextually. They did change the interpretation, but no matter which interpretation you chose, it didn't render something that didn't make sense. Unlike the Masoretic text, which says, like a lion, my hands and feet, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense by itself, versus they pierced my hands and feet, which makes total sense. So going with what makes sense, most translations said, hey, the Septuagint is probably rendering this correctly here, and our Masoretic text has a scribal error here. And so we went back to this, and then I wanted to show you the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we found them in the I forget what I said. I think it was 1960s. So when we found them in the 1960s, we found this particular scroll. And in this scroll, we found the verse in question. And you could see the letters in question, the last letter here being the wow. And you get to see it right next to the yod right here and another yod right here. So you get to see just how close the yod and the wow would have looked in handwriting, but how distinct it is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is clearly a longer stroke than the two yods next to it, right? And you can see the clear difference. And so this brought vindication to the debate between Christians, atheists, and Jews as to whether or not this is directly about suffering of the Messiah, generally speaking, like a lion, my hands and feet, or if it's more about like the crucifixion itself specifically. They pierced my hands and feet. Okay, and still like a lion, my hands and feet. The Jews would have suggested that this, what's the word I'm looking for, but this incomplete sentence would be part of his suffering. That they would say the psalmist is trying to portray how much suffering the Messiah is in by, or David himself, by rendering an incomplete sentence, such like you might mutter if you were in extreme pain, something of that nature. And that's how one way they try to get around this. But this Dead Sea Scroll here being, 1,200 years plus earlier than the Masoretic text, the Septuagint being roughly 1,100 years earlier than the Masoretic text, shows very early traditions of how this verse would have been rendered, how Jews would have been reading it long before the Masoretic text came about. So while the debate is still ongoing, it is much more heavily weighed on the side now that the Septuagint and modern English translations, and not just modern, ancient English translations, all render this the same way and correctly as they pierced my hands and feet. And so with that, we covered certain textual difficulties, and I suggested that the Septuagint should be something that is a regular part of our reading. We should be referencing the Septuagint when we study the Old Testament. We should be looking at it not necessarily as the ultimate authority, but as another study tool to go back to say, how did the Septuagint render this, and how are we rendering it today, and why is there a difference if there's a difference, and work through that. Sometimes it's not about a difference. Sometimes it's about an interpretation. And so this helps you with interpretation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. But I wanted to give you some resources for referring to the Septuagint. Since none of us speak Greek, referring to the Septuagint would be very difficult since it's written in Greek. And so I wanted to show you some English translations, but I also wanted to give you some backstories, how these English translations came to be, what was their underlying text. And so here up there, I have 10 different versions of the Septuagint. These are primary ones. The first 9 are the ones we use most often. And then we have the 10th one, which is fragments and quotes from church fathers and things of that nature. And not all of these are full Old Testament. Some of them are missing chunks of the Old Testament due to wear and tear. We don't have it, or they just didn't copy it for some reason. So I looked at 2 different types of translations of the Septuagint, the diplomatic or the eclectic. The diplomatic just translates primarily from Vaticanus, and any missing portions from Vaticanus would be filled in, usually from Sinaiticus or Alexandrinus. But they might use other ones too if they felt the other ones had some value there. So, but if you get a diplomatic translation, you're primarily getting Vaticanus. That's what you're getting, a reconstruction of Vaticanus. If you get an eclectic one, you're going to get a translation that's looking at all of the evidence available and then making the best decision as to what they thought the original might read. So may not necessarily be Vaticanus in every instance, but probably in most instances, I would say Vaticanus still comes out on top, but not always. And so an eclectic version is going to give you a little bit more resource material to work through. I bring it up later, but I'll bring it up here now. If you get an eclectic version, you're more likely to get an apparatus. An apparatus is essentially just a set of notes, usually on the footnotes, or maybe in the back of the Bible, something of that nature, where they're going to tell you the textual variants of various Septuagints. They'll tell you the Septuagint this Septuagint reads this way, this Septuagint reads this way, this Septuagint reads this way. And you'll get that apparatus in the footnotes. So you'll get all of that extra information. However, if you're just using a diplomatic one, they generally, the ones I've come across, the ones I showed you last week, they generally do not give you an apparatus. They're just, hey, this is a straight rendering. You might get a footnote where they deviate from Vaticanus, not because they thought Vaticanus was wrong, but because it's missing. So they might say Theodotion says this here, missing from Vaticanus, something of that nature. Okay. And then I showed you what are Greek reconstructions of the LXX, modern Greek reconstructions. There's in the diplomatic one, the primary one is Sweets. He did the Sweets LXX. And then on the eclectic side, we have Ralph's as one that's been used for a long time. Both of those have been used for a very long time. But Göttingen is a modern work. It's still in progress. And a lot of our translations come from that one as well. So we went through the Brenton LXX, the pros and cons to that. I'm not going to get into all of these right now. I'm just going to go quite to the end here so we can move on. But we have the Brenton LXX. We have the Orthodox Study Bible LXX. We have the Lexham English LXX or Septuagint, and we have the New English translation of the Septuagint. And with that, those would be the 4 primary Septuagints. I would recommend you grab at least one of them, if not all 4. If you can grab all 4, I think that's even better. But the Brenton Septuagint being a diplomatic translation, older scholarship lines up quite well with the KJV if you want to compare to the KJV. The Orthodox Study Bible is an eclectic translation written in the same form as the NKJV. It is eclectic. You get extra Greek Orthodox study notes if you're interested in what they believe. You'll get some early patristic quotes too, which I really like. So there's that, the Orthodox Study Bible. Then the Lexham English Septuagint, probably the best one if you just want to read the Septuagint. If you just want to sit down and read the Septuagint, grab the Lexham English Septuagint. It's a pleasure to read. It's very easy to read. They formatted it nicely. It's beautiful. But it is a diplomatic translation. So not a lot of footnotes, not a lot to get you distracted in other ways. I don't typically use it as a study tool, but as a reading tool. And then my favorite study tool of this 4 is the NETS, the New English translation of the Septuagint. It's an eclectic one. It's got lots of footnotes. It's got the primary and alternate text side by side, so you can see them next to each other. I talked about what those meant last week. And so that is the Septuagint closed. And if you have any questions on the Septuagint, feel free to ask me. I'd like to answer them. So now we're going to go into the next early translations, are the Aramaic and Syriac translations. So we know the Old Testament was primarily written in Hebrew, correct? So, but we also know eventually the Old Testament moved from the Paleo-Hebrew script to the Aramaic square script. And that happened, we believe, sometime during Ezra and Nehemiah's time. And during Ezra and Nehemiah's time, we have the Babylonian reign. And what we have, this still happens today. Not as frequently, but it's still happening. What you have is when you have one country take over nearly the entire known world, that country's native language becomes the lingua franca. So when Babylon took over essentially the whole known world, Aramaic, which was the native tongue of the Babylonians, became the lingua franca of the day. When Ezra and Nehemiah show up on the scene, you can read Ezra and Nehemiah together, and you'll see that about half the people in their day could not speak Hebrew. And so that they had to, Ezra wanted to reintroduce the Old Testament to them. It had not been being used. Half the people had forgotten Hebrew. So he's bringing it back in. He's re-bringing in temple ordinances and structures and things of that nature. And in doing that, they have to translate the Old Testament as well for these people who don't speak Hebrew. And so this is believed potentially, and I would say very likely, the first time we're going to get an Old Testament translation of the Hebrew into Aramaic, which would be called a Targum. Targum is the Aramaic word for translation. Now, we don't have anything extant from that time period. This is a supposition based on the evidence that we have, but we don't have any objective evidence. We don't have any manuscripts from Ezra and Nehemiah's day that is an Aramaic Targum. In fact, we're not even sure when the first Aramaic Targum would have come about or how it came about. We just they just they just showed up. They just showed up in history. And generally speaking, both the Jewish and Christian Aramaic translations are going to show up around the 1st century, though that's probably not the first time they were used. Maybe the Christian ones for sure, but the Jewish ones may have been around before that. We just don't have anything physical to hold our hands on. And so let's talk about lingua francas for a second. So Babylon conquers, Aramaic becomes the world language for everybody. Everyone's speaking Aramaic. After Babylon falls and Alexander the Great takes over, this would be during the years where the Apocrypha would be written, and the Septuagint's being written, and all those, during those particular years, Aramaic will be on a decline and Greek will be on the uprise. Okay. And after the Greek Empire falls apart and the Roman Empire takes over, you're going to have Greek on the decline and you're going to have Latin on the uprise. And so in Jesus's day, you have Rome there, but Latin's not the primary language yet. Greek is still the primary language, and Aramaic is still holding on. In a few places, Aramaic is still being spoken. In fact, where Jesus is from, Galilee, Nazareth, and most parts of Israel, Aramaic was still the common language in Israel. Okay, not necessarily a world language, but in Israel, it's holding on. Greek is the lingua franca of everybody. Everyone speaks Greek. So whether you lived in Israel or in Rome or somewhere outside there, everyone's speaking Greek. And then, so when Jesus is around, the question is, what languages did Jesus speak? Well, we know he read Hebrew. Hebrew was still being used in the synagogues, though it wasn't the common tongue. It wasn't what people were speaking in the streets. So you went to synagogue, you heard Hebrew. So Jesus would have known Hebrew when he went to synagogue and taught and preached. When he was out and about, he likely spoke Aramaic, and we'll show some of that later. So Aramaic is what Jesus would have spoke. So he would have been at least bilingual there. And then we also know everyone spoke Greek. So trilingual. It's possible that he might have even known some Latin, because Latin is up and coming. It's not the norm. It's slowly moving in. So it's possible he knew even 4 languages. Obviously, he's God, so he knows all the languages. But I'm talking about from a human perspective here, which ones is he using and using daily on a regular basis? He's probably not using Latin on a regular basis, but that doesn't mean there aren't some Roman downpourings from the government that are coming in Latin and maybe being translated into Greek or Hebrew, or, well, not Hebrew, but Greek or Aramaic. And so those are the swings there. So while Aramaic is still being used in the diaspora and things of that nature, Christians are going to want to translate the Bible into Aramaic. Okay, just like they wanted to translate the Bible into Greek earlier, not necessarily Christians, but Jews, they translated the Bible into Greek. Christians continued that. There are multiple Christian Septuagints that happen later that are done by Christians, but they look pretty much like the ones I was talking about. And if you look at some of those names that I put on that list, some of those are just Christian names, and they're Septuagint versions. And we talked about Origen's Hexapla, where he puts the Septuagint side by side, the different variations. So some of those are done by Christians. Now, I want to talk about the Syriac and Aramaic translations, but I could cover it almost identically to the way I covered the Septuagint, in which I show you some textual variances and translation difficulties, and show you how the Syriac, Peshitta, and so on handle these situations. But instead, I want to show you a different way in which these translations have impacted us. And this is what's called translation philosophy. Actually, before I leave this page, some of you might be looking at that and seeing red letters up there and wondering what those red letters are. It is not a red letter edition of the Peshitta in which the words of Christ are put in red. That is not what's occurring here. We'll talk about that later, but that doesn't happen this early. What happens in the Peshitta, this particular picture that I pulled from the Museum of the Bible, is a 9th century Peshitta. So it's a later one. And what would happen is when one book would end, they would write a subscription that that book had ended. And then they would write the superscription of the next book. And they would write those in red to distinguish it from the text of scripture. So this one up here, I had to get some help because I can't read it. I did ask for some people to help me out. This one here says that the epistle of 1 John has ended and that the epistle of Paul to the Romans is beginning. So it's a weird order, 1 John to Romans. It's not typical. It's not the typical way we move through the New Testament. We'll talk about how we got our New Testament order later. But yeah, so that's what that red letter is. That's just the superscription and the subscription of the two books ending and joining. Instead of starting on the next page, they just keep going and let you know in red letters, this is the end and beginning of the next book. So there's that. All right, so translation philosophy. I mentioned this earlier with the Septuagint. I talked about formal and functional translations. And so formal and functional, we'll talk about what those mean in a minute, but I want to kind of just focus your attention for a moment here on the left side, the extreme left side, the interlinear side, and the extreme right side, the paraphrase. I'm going to talk about those first, and then we'll talk about translation philosophy between formal and functional, okay? So interlinears, I'm going to make the case right now that they are not actually translations. They're not translations. They are, what they do is they generally will give you a complementary English word underneath the Greek or Hebrew word in question. So it's going to look something like this. So this is a Greek English interlinear. This is from the CSB Bible particularly. And so if you notice, okay, good. I'm glad I did what I did for the next slide. So I couldn't tell on my computer how readable this was going to be up here. So the next slide I have it zoomed in. But let's see if I can give you a little bit of a taste here. This top line here is Matthew 1:1 as it's found in Greek. And then each word underneath is the English word. And that's nearly impossible for you all to read here. So just in case, I was like, I don't know if this is actually going to be readable. I just zoomed in on a particular one. So here, I just went to John 1:1, and I zoomed in on the page in here on my phone and took a picture of it. So you'll see, if you were to read this, you're familiar with John 1:1 through 5. So I'm just going to read it to you in English as it's rendered in an interlinear Bible. So it says, in the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word, he was with the God, and God, he was the Word. This one, he was in the beginning with the God. All things through him, it came to be, and apart from him, it came to be. Not even one thing which it has come to be. In him, life there was, and the life, it was the light of the men. And the light in the darkness, it shines, yet the darkness, it overcame. That's horrible. All right. This does not make any sense at all. So interlinear Bibles would be considered the most literal. They're often called literal translations, although I don't think they should be called translation at all. And the reason why I don't call them a translation is because they strip too much out of the receptor language to be a valuable translation, right? It does not follow the English syntax. It doesn't follow English grammar rules. It is all over the place because it's following the Greek. So it is like trying to shove the Greek rules into English. And so these are not valuable as a translation. So I see people all the time abuse interlinear Bibles where they see a translation difficulty or something like that, and then they go to an interlinear and they see an English word underneath the Greek word, and they think they've created a shortcut to a lexicon and said, aha, I have the answer. It's clearly, that's the word in Greek. And that's not at all what interlinear should be used for. It's not a shortcut to a lexicon. In fact, it's not a good tool for that at all. You need to still go to a lexicon. This is actually most helpful for people who are learning Greek and Hebrew. This is most helpful. In fact, Holman, who produces the CSB and this interlinear, understands that that's what this tool should be used for. And so in this case, the interlinear that comes with this, or the interlinear this, comes with a little tool. It's a tool that you would use to block the English words underneath the Greek words. And this, the inside column, I didn't mention this, but this inside column here, or I should say the outside column. The outside column here is the CSB rendered as it normally is, just as you would read it in a normal CSB. So you do get an actual translation here next to the interlinear, which is helpful. A lot of interlinears do it that way. It's a pretty common practice now. But if you're learning Greek and you don't want to cheat, you would put this over the English word, so all you can see is the Greek, and it blocks the outside margin. And then you would attempt to read the Greek and interpret it. And then if you wanted to check your answer, you just slide down and see if your answer is correct in the English. So it's a really helpful tool for people wanting to learn the source language. That is really what it's good for. Before we had a lot of digital access, it would also have been really good to go to an interlinear to find out what the Greek or Hebrew word was, so that you could go to a lexicon and open up a lexicon to that Greek or Hebrew word. But because of digital resources now, it's made that almost entirely obsolete, so that the real main purpose now for an interlinear Bible would be to learn the underlying text. Or if you, hey, some people are just like, I want to touch a physical book. Well, then it's still good for that as well. Touch the physical book and go to a lexicon. All right, so that's interlinear. That's the extreme end of literal. So extreme, I say it's not even a translation, okay? On the other end, we have the paraphrase. So on the paraphrase is, there we go. The other end, we have the paraphrase. On a paraphrase is, they really want to get across the meaning of the passage, so much so that they're willing to use, generally speaking, a lot of extra words to get there. And using a lot of those extra words, they will stray from the underlying text to give much more explanatory power to the text to help you understand it. This is a little easier to see in English than the interlinear was, but let me just show you a paraphrase in comparison. So here is Proverbs 1 through 6 in the CSB. This is not a paraphrase. This is just how most translations handle the text of Proverbs 1 through 6. But this is going to be brought up just so you can see, if you're not familiar with Proverbs 1, how paraphrase works. So Proverbs 1 through 6 just reads, as typical in most translations, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for learning wisdom and discipline, for understanding insightful sayings, for receiving prudent instruction in righteousness, justice, and integrity, for teaching shrewdness to the inexperienced, knowledge and discretion to a young man. Let a wise person listen and increase knowledge, or increase learning, and let a discerning person obtain guidance. For understanding a proverb or a parable, the words of the wise and their riddles. Okay, so that's pretty standard translation. Some might be more difficult or less difficult depending on where they are in the translation spectrum, but that's a good, reliable translation. Now, we'll read the same thing in the Message. The Message is a paraphrase Bible, and so we'll read the same thing there, and we'll get this. These are the wise sayings of Solomon, David's son, Israel's king. So far, not really any different, all right? Written down so we'll know how to live right, live well and right, to understand what life means and where it's going, a manual for living, for learning what's right and just and fair, to teach the inexperienced the ropes, using English idioms here, right? Bringing it into English idioms, to give our young people a grasp on reality. There's something here also for seasoned men and women. I actually found that helpful, the way he rendered that as a, let's see, let a wise person listen and increase learning. So it's for the inexperienced, but also if you're experienced, if you are already wise, listen and learn anyway. So I thought that was helpful how they rendered that. Still a thing or two for the experienced to learn, fresh wisdom to probe and penetrate, the rhymes and reasons of wise men and young and women. Okay. So there seems to be, at least culturally speaking, within Christianity, a much more willingness to accept interlinear Bibles as a useful tool and almost a disdain for paraphrase Bibles as an unuseful tool. And so before you jump all over the message and say something to the effect of, that's horrible, that's awful, it's not even a translation. Well, it's not. It's not a translation. Okay? It is, think of the message and paraphrase Bibles as verse by verse, verse long commentaries. That's what they are. Verse by verse, verse long commentaries. And so you shouldn't necessarily use them as authoritative, but you're going to use it as a tool to help you understand what is being said in the original language in a very simple way. And that was the intent of Eugene Peterson, who is the creator of the message, not exclusively. It's not a sole project. He had a bunch of scholars help him as well, but he's the primary source. He did all of the heavy lifting. Eugene Peterson was the pastor. He died, I think, in 2018, if I remember correctly. He died in 2018, but he was a pastor of a church in Bel Air, Maryland. And while he was preaching in that church, he began to have a real heart for the people in his church that were illiterate. He had some illiterate people, and they just struggled to read a Bible, any Bible. Okay, they were near illiterate. And he did something I thought was fascinating. I was listening to some interviews from him to prepare for this. And one of the things that he did was he just listened. He studied, actually, how his congregation spoke, how they spoke to each other, the words they used, the phrases they used, the idioms they used. And he took that to heart. And then he went to his work on, he was well-versed in both Greek and Hebrew. He was very well-versed in both Greek and Hebrew. So he goes to the Greek and Hebrew, and then he begins to paraphrase what the Greek and Hebrew are saying into the vernacular of his congregation. That was his intent, to put it in the vernacular of his congregation specifically so that they could open a Bible and read it with relative ease as a middle ground between knowing nothing and getting to a translation that they struggled with. Okay? Paraphrase Bibles are not a new thing in Christian history. They've been used throughout Christian history. They never last long. I've not seen one that's still like around today as a big deal and we're still using it. They never last long. But Erasmus did a paraphrase Bible during the Reformation. Paraphrase, I think Origen did one. There's a whole bunch of paraphrase Bibles throughout Christian history. And a large reason why is because of literacy rates. Literacy rates today are very, very high, relatively speaking, to the rest of church history. And so paraphrase Bibles were that middle ground to move people from being illiterate to understanding something simple to understanding something more complicated. And this is just how, I mean, we do the same thing in school, right? We start with Dr. Seuss before we give them a book on physics, okay? So Christians have always had literacy in mind and how to get people from illiterate to literate. However, books being expensive and things of that nature, sometimes it was easier to write a paraphrase than to sit down and do a hard translation. So this was Peterson's work. It was I think it was well received, surprisingly, almost too well received. I say that because people began to use it as their primary Bible. And so that's the danger. That was not necessarily his intention. He wanted it to be used as a tool with their Bible, but not a replacement for their Bible. And so because people began to use it as a primary Bible, there was the pushback that it's not a Bible. And in a sense, I agree. It's not really a Bible in the sense of a religious authoritative text, okay? But it is a Bible in the sense of the Latin word. It's a book. So the message book, okay? And so there was a large pushback against the message Bible. And I understand it, but it's a knee-jerk reaction. We just need to put the message where it belongs in its category, just like we do with interlinear Bibles, okay? This is just the opposite end of the spectrum for translation philosophy. We know interlinear Bibles are limited in their helpfulness, as are paraphrase Bibles like the message. They're limited in their helpfulness. So use them. Maybe when you get to a part in any translation, you get to a translation and you flip through 6 or 7 translations and you're like, I still don't get it. maybe now the Message Bible is free online. Type it in, see what it says, see if that helps you unpack what the scriptures are saying in an actual translation. And so here we have that full spectrum here. We have the two extreme ends. We have the extreme end of the interlinear, not really a translation, and we have the extreme end of paraphrase, not really a translation. And then we move in just a little bit. We move into now where we're not being so literal that it's inaccessible to the common person, and we're not being so paraphrastic that it doesn't render exactly what the underlying source text says. So we don't want to remove too much from English, and we don't want to add too much to the source text. That would be the extreme ends, okay? So neither are good translation philosophies, neither, okay? Some people, like I said, people tend to have, and they tend to see, oh, interlinears are okay, but paraphrases, we shouldn't use them. Nope, use both in their purposes, but neither are good translation philosophies. So formal translations are going to focus on adding as little as possible to the original languages. And functional translations are going to focus on losing as little as possible in the receptor language. Okay, we want the receptor language to maintain all of its structure and meaning and so on and so forth, so that's easy for the reader to understand. The formal says we're willing to sacrifice some of the structure in the receptor language to retain the structure of the source language, because we think some of that holds meaning as well. So neither philosophy is wrong. Some people prefer one over the other. We'll talk more about that. But there used to be different terms up on the screen. Right now, you have formal and functional, in the middle, optimal. We'll talk about optimal in a second. I'll talk about it now. Optimal is a relatively new term that's used within the last 20 years or so. Roughly the last 20 years, optimal has shown up on the scene. It's got a heavy marketing weight to its term, optimal. Well, that's what I want. I want the optimal translation. I don't particularly like the heavy weight that comes with the word optimal, but it's been accepted. And other translations are saying, hey, we're optimal as well. But optimal is really just balanced. That's really what it is. We're going to try to balance the functional and the formal in such a way that we're not losing anything from the receptor language and we're not losing anything from the source language. Okay, we're trying to retain as much as possible on both sides, and no one can do this perfectly. There's always going to be some loss some way or the other. And so where do you allow that loss to exist, on a formal side or functional side, or you try to balance that loss across the board? Okay, but these words, formal and functional, used to use a different meaning. Literal and dynamic used to be what they were called. They used to be called literal translations and dynamic translations. Those terms have dropped largely because they weren't helpful, especially the literal one. The literal one gave people the impression that translations were happening like interlinears, where you just had a word and then an English word, a Greek word, English word, Greek word, English word, and that's all you did. But no translation is entirely literal. Every translation is going to make some choices, and they're going to move down the spectrum. So almost all of our translations that we have today actually aren't on the extreme end of functional and formal. They're all a little closer to optimal. Okay, so they're in this spectrum. They're in this spectrum there. And so translators have to make thousands upon thousands of choices as they're translating. How do we translate this? How do we translate that? Do we go with a functional translation or a formal translation? And they're doing that on every verse. So sometimes some translations that are generally functional may choose a formal translation for a particular verse. And translations that are generally formal might choose a functional translation for a particular verse. And let me show you one where, okay, I wanted to give you an example here. If I were to tell you, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move quickly. If I were to say, I don't know, he's got a long nose, what would you think I'm referring to? If I said someone's got a long nose? Huh? Physical appearance? Okay, what if I said he's quite the storyteller? He's got a long nose. Pinocchio, yeah. Yeah, so generally speaking, when we talk about someone having a long nose, or I don't know, your nose is growing, we are calling that person a liar, right? And that only works because that only works because of the success of Pinocchio, right? Because Pinocchio was such a success in our culture, we've developed metaphors and idioms based on a movie or a story, I should say. It was probably the movie that really pushed it, though. So we call someone with a long nose, we say they're a liar. However, the long nose idiom exists in Hebrew. It exists in Hebrew, but it doesn't mean the same thing. So if we go to Nehemiah 17b, all right, I've put up a slew of English translations on there, and I'm going to demonstrate to you that not one of them renders this verse literally. Not one. None of them render this verse literally. They all move down to the functional end of the spectrum for this verse. They all, and I don't know if you can figure it out. I'm not going to read them all because I don't have time. But if you can figure out what set of words up there is the idiom for having a long nose. Only one of the translations up there actually gives you a hint. The rest of them don't give you any clues at all. So I'll just move on to the next slide because I don't have time for this. The words highlighted in yellow, slow to anger, is literally in Hebrew having a long nose. And the only translation that gets you somewhat close to that idiom is the Young's literal translation, where they use long suffering. They don't use the word nose, but they keep the word long in there. And so when you're talking about God and you say, I'll read it in the CSB, but you are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, long-nosed, and abounding in faithful love, and you did not abandon them. Well, if we translate that literally, we might think something weird about God's physical features. Does he have an actual long nose? Okay, not one translation renders that literal. And for good reason, because it wouldn't make sense. In fact, it could mean something very wrong about God. He's a liar, potentially, that he's long-nosed in our culture. So translations have to do this all the time. All right, let me see here. I can't read my next slide, so I don't know if I want to go to it, but we'll go to it anyway. We'll do it next week. We'll cover the next slide next week because I'm not going to have time to explain everything. So we'll cover more about translation philosophy. We'll move back into the Syriac, Peshitta, and other Aramaic translations and help us understand why those translations and their translation philosophies still impact us today, and some of the interesting situations that they uniquely had to deal with being an Aramaic translation. All right, that will be it for this week. We'll pick it up next week. You all have a good day.